The days following the explosive HOA meeting felt like a turning point for Maplewood Drive. Karen didn't give up. Far from it. But her attempts to enforce the vegan-only rule grew increasingly desperate and ineffective. She sent out formal warning letters to half the neighborhood, accusing them of violating community standards. She scheduled emergency meetings that barely anyone attended. At one point, she even tried to rally support by posting flyers around the cul-de-sac with slogans like, "Save our planet," "Go vegan." But instead of inspiring change, her efforts only made her look more out of touch. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood began to feel lighter. People who had once tiptoed around Karen's rules now walked taller, bolder. Conversations at the mailbox or over backyard fences turned into brainstorming sessions about how to make the community better, not just for some, but for everyone. Evelyn became an unofficial leader of sorts, encouraging neighbors to voice their opinions and find creative solutions to problems. Her neon green door and cactus garden no longer seemed eccentric. They symbolized individuality and courage. One afternoon, as I was watering my plants, Linda Peterson stopped by. To my surprise, she wasn't clutching her usual copy of the HOA handbook. Instead, she held a plate covered with foil. "I brought you something," she said hesitantly, handing it over. Inside was a slice of her famous apple pie. "Thanks," I said, unsure what to make of this unexpected gesture. "What's the occasion?" Linda sighed, looking down at her shoes. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened at the meeting," she admitted. "Maybe Karen went too far this time. I mean, we all want Maplewood to be a nice place to live, but maybe there's room for compromise." Her words caught me off guard. Linda had always been Karen's biggest supporter, the first to nod along whenever she announced a new rule. Hearing her question, Karen's methods felt like watching cracks form in a dam. "It's not too late to change things," I told her gently. "We can still work together to make the neighborhood better, for everyone." She nodded slowly, then turned to leave, pacing back toward her house. As I watched her go, I realized something important. Karen's influence was waning because people were starting to see through her rigid approach. Rules weren't meant to control every aspect of our lives. They were supposed to help us coexist peacefully. And when those rules started feeling oppressive, it was okay to push back. Karen's final attempt to regain control came during another HOA meeting a few weeks later. This time, attendance was sparse. Only a handful of loyalists showed up, including Linda, though she spent most of the meeting staring silently at the floor. Karen stood at the front of the room, her clipboard trembling slightly in her hands. "If we don't enforce these guidelines," she said, her voice tinged with desperation, "then what's the point of having them at all?" No one answered. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, Evelyn spoke up. "The point is to create a community where people feel welcome and respected," she said firmly. "Not scared to grill a burger or bake a pie. Maybe it's time to rethink what really matters here." Her words hung in the air, unchallenged. Even Karen couldn't argue with that. After a long pause, she muttered something about needing to review the guidelines and dismissed the meeting early. It was clear to everyone. She'd lost. Over the next few weeks, the HOA board quietly revised its policies. The vegan-only clause disappeared, replaced with a vague suggestion to consider sustainability when planning events. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. More importantly, it marked a shift in how decisions were made. Neighbors started attending meetings not because they were forced to, but because they genuinely wanted to contribute. Ideas flowed freely, compromises were reached, and for the first time in years, Maplewood Drive felt like a true community. Greg noticed the difference too. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. "You know," he said, "this place feels different now. Like we actually belong here." I nodded, sipping my lemonade. "Yeah," I said softly. "And it's because we stood up for ourselves. Together." As summer gave way to fall, the neighborhood settled into its new rhythm. The grills stayed out. The laughter lingered longer. and the sense of connection grew stronger. Karen faded into the background, her clipboard gathering dust. Rumor had it she joined a meditation retreat to find inner peace, though no one knew for sure. What mattered was that we'd reclaimed Maplewood Drive, not just from Karen, but from fear itself. Let me tell you a story about Karen. Oh, Karen asterisk. If you've ever lived in a neighborhood with strict rules, you probably know someone like her. She's the type of person who always has a clipboard in hand and a scowl on her face, ready to point out every little thing you're doing wrong. In our neighborhood, Karen wasn't just any ordinary resident. She was the head of the Homeowners Association, HOA. And let me tell you, she took that role very seriously. Karen had been running things in Maplewood Drive for years. Under her leadership, life was predictable, but also, well, suffocating. There were rules for everything. You couldn't leave your trash cans out past 7 a.m., or you'd get a warning letter. Holiday lights, only allowed 2 weeks before Christmas. Even the grass on your lawn had to be cut to a specific height. It felt less like living in a neighborhood and more like being part of a military operation. But nothing could have prepared us for what happened last spring. At one of the HOA meetings, which I only went to because Greg guilt-tripped me into it, Karen announced something so shocking that everyone sat there in stunned silence. Standing at the front of the room like she was delivering some grand proclamation, she declared, effective immediately, all residents must follow a plant-based diet while on community property. Yes, you heard that right. A vegan-only rule. No meat, no dairy, no eggs, not just for personal meals, but for anything food-related happening in yards, driveways, or public spaces. According to Karen, this was all about saving the environment. She said animal farming was bad for the planet, so we needed to make a change. But honestly, it felt less like an effort to save the earth, and more like Karen trying to control yet another aspect of our lives. The room exploded after that. People started talking over each other, some yelling objections, others laughing nervously. A few people actually clapped. Linda Peterson, the queen of following rules, was among them. But most of us were too stunned to react. How could Karen think she had the authority to dictate what we ate? Who gave her the power to decide whether we could grill burgers or bake lasagna? As I drove home that night, I kept replaying Karen's announcement in my head. It wasn't just ridiculous, it was infuriating. What made her think she could impose such a bizarre rule on everyone? Sure, eating fewer animal products might help the environment, but forcing people to go vegan in their own homes, that was crossing a line. Greg could see how upset I was when I got home. He tried to calm me down by saying we should ignore it and hope Karen would forget about it in a week or two. But ignoring Karen never worked. If anything, it made her double down on whatever crazy idea she came up with next. Besides, this time felt different. This wasn't just about aesthetics or noise levels. It was about food, something deeply personal and tied to culture, family traditions, and memories. That's when inspiration hit me. What better way to fight back than by doing exactly what Karen didn't want? A huge barbecue party right in the middle of Maplewood Drive. Imagine it. Grilled smoking, burgers sizzling, ribs glistening under the summer sun. The smell alone would drive Karen up the wall. And maybe, just maybe, it would remind everyone, including Karen, that life is supposed to be enjoyed, not micromanaged. The more I thought about it, the more excited I became. I knew I couldn't do it alone, though. So the next day, I reached out to Evelyn Harper, the rebel of the neighborhood who had once fought the HOA over her neon green front door. If anyone understood how to stand up to Karen, it was Evelyn. When I told her my plan, she loved it instantly. "Count me in," she said with a mischievous grin. "And don't worry, I'll bring dessert. Something extra indulgent." With Evelyn on board, the pieces began falling into place. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, and soon nearly every household wanted to contribute. Some brought steaks, others brought sides, and a few brave souls volunteered to man the grills. We were going big. and Karen wouldn't know what hit her. After Karen's absurd announcement about the vegan-only rule, the neighborhood was buzzing with disbelief and frustration. Conversations that used to revolve around weekend plans or gardening tips now turned into heated debates about Karen's latest overreach. Social media groups dedicated to Maplewood living became battlegrounds for opinions. Memes mocking Karen's decree popped up daily. One showed a cartoon cow holding a sign that read, "Sorry, Karen, I'm not invited to your BBQ anymore." Another featured a pig saying, "Guess I'll just hang out in the shadows." People were angry, but they were also scared. Karen had a reputation for being relentless when it came to enforcing rules. She'd send warning letters faster than most people could blink, and if you ignored those, she wasn't above escalating things further. Fines, legal threats, even involving lawyers. No one wanted to risk becoming her next target. But at the same time, no one wanted to give in either. The idea of being told what we could eat on our own property felt like a step too far. That's where Evelyn Harper came in. Evelyn wasn't exactly known for playing by the rules. When she first moved into the neighborhood, she painted her front door neon green, installed wind chimes loud enough to wake the dead, and planted cacti along her walkway instead of roses. The HOA hated her, but secretly, many of us admired her. She had a way of standing up for herself without backing down, and she always seemed to come out on top. When I pitched my idea of hosting a massive barbecue as an act of defiance, Evelyn didn't hesitate. "Oh, this is going to be fun," she said, her eyes lighting up. "Let's make it unforgettable." Together, we started planning. We knew we couldn't afford to tip off Karen too early, so we kept things quiet. Communication happened through coded messages. "Bring napkins" meant condiments, and "extra plates" translated to beer. It was like organizing a secret mission, except instead of spies, we had suburban families armed with spatulas and grills. Evelyn took charge of strategy. She suggested setting up tables in the cul-de-sac and blocking off traffic with lawn chairs and caution tape. "Safety first," she joked. "Can't have cars ruining the vibe." She also recommended timing the event for a Saturday afternoon when most families would already be home, making it harder for Karen to intervene without causing a scene. Her confidence was contagious, and soon, others started chipping in ideas. Word spread quickly, mostly through word of mouth and subtle hints. Mr. Thompson from across the street offered his industrial-sized smoker, while Mrs. Patel promised to bring her famous potato salad. Even shy little Timmy Jenkins volunteered to contribute a bag of marshmallows for roasting later. Everyone wanted to play a part, whether big or small. It was amazing how something as simple as food could bring people together. As the date approached, excitement grew. Neighbors whispered conspiratorially behind hedges, giggling like kids planning a prank. For the first time in ages, Maplewood Drive felt alive with camaraderie instead of resentment. People who barely spoke to each other before were suddenly swapping recipes and sharing stories. It was like we'd rediscovered what it meant to be a community. Still, there was one looming question. What would Karen do? She hadn't mentioned the vegan rule again since the meeting, which either meant she'd forgotten about it, unlikely, or was biding her time, very likely. Either way, we knew she wouldn't take kindly to our festivities. When the day finally arrived, we'd need to be ready for anything she threw at us. The night before the big event, I lay awake, replaying scenarios in my head. Would Karen show up yelling? Would she try to shut us down mid-grill? Or worse, would she call the cops? Greg assured me everything would work out, but I couldn't shake the feeling of anticipation. This wasn't just about burgers and ribs anymore. It was about standing up for ourselves, about proving that Maplewood Drive belonged to all of us, not just Karen and her clipboard. By morning, the air smelled faintly of charcoal and possibility. Today was the day. As I stepped outside to help set up, I saw neighbors already hard at work, arranging tables, lighting grills, and hanging streamers between trees. There was a sense of purpose in the air, a shared determination to reclaim our neighborhood, and maybe even have a little fun while doing it. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. Karen was in for a surprise. The day of the barbecue arrived, and Maplewood Drive transformed into a scene straight out of a summer festival. By noon, the cul-de-sac was alive with activity. Grills lined both sides of the street, their charcoal aromas mixing with the scent of sizzling meats and freshly baked bread. Long tables groaned under the weight of casseroles, chips, pitchers of lemonade, and platters piled high with food. Kids darted around playing tag, while adults lounged in folding chairs, laughing and chatting like old friends reunited after years apart. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the atmosphere. For once, the neighborhood felt relaxed, joyful even. People who had barely spoken to each other before were now bonding over shared recipes and grilling techniques. Mrs. Patel proudly explained how she added a secret ingredient to her potato salad that made it extra creamy, while Mr. Thompson demonstrated his smoker setup like he was giving a TED talk. Even Evelyn, who usually kept to herself, was in the thick of things, showing off her famous mac and cheese casserole, loaded with 3 kinds of cheese and topped with crispy breadcrumbs. I stood back for a moment, taking it all in. The sun hung high in the sky, casting golden light over the scene. Music played softly from a portable speaker someone had brought, blending harmoniously with the hum of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter. It was beautiful. For the first time in ages, Maplewood Drive felt less like a collection of houses governed by rules and more like a real community, a place where people cared about each other and enjoyed each other's company. But as much as I wanted to lose myself in the moment, I couldn't shake the nagging thought at the back of my mind. Where was Karen? She hadn't shown up yet, but I knew better than to think she'd forgotten or given up. Karen didn't give up. Ever. If anything, her absence only made me more anxious. What was she planning? Was she waiting for the perfect moment to swoop in and ruin everything? My fears weren't unfounded. Around 1 p.m., just as the first platters of food started making their way to the tables, she appeared. Karen marched down the street like a general leading troops into battle. Her clipboard was tucked firmly under one arm, and her face was set in a grimace so severe it looked painful. Behind her trailed Linda Peterson, clutching a copy of the HOA handbook like it was some kind of holy scripture. "This is unacceptable," Karen bellowed, stopping in front of the main grill station. Smoke billowed around her, momentarily obscuring her features. "You're violating Article 17, Section C of the Association Guidelines." The crowd froze. Forks hovered midair, plates paused halfway to mouths, and conversations died instantly. For a brief moment, it felt like the entire neighborhood held its breath. Tension crackled in the air as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Karen scanned the gathering, her eyes narrowing as they landed on plate after plate of forbidden foods. Juicy burgers, tender chicken wings, racks of ribs glistening with sauce. It was all there, laid out in defiance of her rule. Her jaw tightened, and she raised her clipboard like a weapon. "Do you have any idea how irresponsible this is?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Then, out of nowhere, Evelyn stepped forward. She held a plate piled high with ribs, her expression calm but determined. "Oh, hi, Karen," she said sweetly, as if they'd bumped into each other at the grocery store. "Care for a bite?" Her words broke the tension like a pinprick bursting a balloon. A ripple of nervous laughter spread through the crowd, followed by murmurs of agreement. Someone shouted, "Yeah, Karen. Live a little." Another neighbor chimed in, "Come on, it's just food." Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red. She opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Instead, she glared at Evelyn, then at the crowd, her gaze sweeping over the sea of defiant faces. Finally, without another word, she spun on her heel and stormed off, Linda trailing behind her like a loyal shadow. As soon as they were out of sight, cheers erupted. Plates clinked together in celebration, and someone cranked up the music, turning the afternoon into a full-blown party. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Karen wouldn't let something like this slide, not without a fight. Still, for now, we had won. And as I watched my neighbors laughing, eating, and enjoying themselves, I realized that maybe, just maybe, we were stronger together than we ever could be apart. Karen's dramatic exit left the neighborhood buzzing with a mix of triumph and nervous energy. For a few moments after she stormed off, no one knew quite what to do. Should we celebrate, or brace ourselves for round two of her wrath? But as the music blared louder and the smell of sizzling burgers filled the air, hesitation gave way to jubilation. Plates were passed around, laughter erupted, and soon it felt like Karen's presence, and her ridiculous rule, had been nothing more than a bad dream. Evelyn was at the center of it all, holding court with her plate of ribs like some kind of rebel queen. "Did you see her face?" she said, grinning ear to ear as neighbors gathered around her. Priceless. Everyone laughed, but beneath the surface, there was a shared understanding. This wasn't just about food. It was about standing up to someone who had tried to control every aspect of our lives, and for the first time in years, we'd done something about it. As the afternoon wore on, the party grew livelier. Kids chased each other with water guns, leaving trails of giggles and wet footprints across driveways. Adults swapped stories over cold drinks, reminiscing about past HOA dramas, and speculating about what Karen might try next. Someone even brought out a karaoke machine, prompting impromptu performances that ranged from hilarious to surprisingly good. By sunset, the cul-de-sac looked less like a suburban street and more like the set of a block party movie. But despite the fun, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't done. She'd left too quickly, too quietly. Her silence felt ominous, like the calm before a storm. Sure enough, halfway through dessert, a glorious spread of pies, cakes, and Evelyn's decadent chocolate brownies, she reappeared. This time, she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was none other than Mr. Dawson, the HOA's lawyer. The sight of them sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. Conversations trailed off. Forks froze mid-bite, and eyes turned toward the duo. Karen's expression was unreadable, but Mr. Dawson carried himself with the smug confidence of someone who thought he already had the upper hand. He cleared his throat loudly, silencing the last remnants of chatter. "I'm here to address a serious violation of community guidelines," he began, his tone formal and clipped. "The event taking place today is in direct contravention of Article 17, Section C, which prohibits the preparation and consumption of non-plant-based foods on community property." Before anyone could respond, Evelyn stepped forward again, her plate still in hand. "Oh, hi, Mr. Dawson," she said cheerfully, as if greeting an old friend. "Care for a brownie? They're vegan-friendly." The joke earned scattered laughter, but Mr. Dawson didn't smile. Instead, he adjusted his glasses and continued. "This isn't a laughing matter," he said sternly. "The rules exist for a reason, to maintain order and promote sustainability within the neighborhood. If these regulations are ignored, it sets a dangerous precedent." His words hung heavy in the air. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was he right? Had we gone too far? Sustainability was important, after all. Maybe Karen's intentions weren't entirely wrong. They were just extreme. Some neighbors shifted uncomfortably, glancing at their plates of ribs and chicken wings with newfound guilt. Sensing the shift in mood, Evelyn spoke up again. "You're missing the point," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension. "This isn't about burgers versus salads. It's about choice, about letting people decide for themselves how they want to live. Community isn't about forcing everyone to conform. It's about finding ways to coexist despite our differences." Her words struck a chord. Neighbors nodded in agreement, murmuring support. Even Mr. Jenkins, who usually avoided conflict, chimed in. "Come on, folks," he said, standing up. "We're not hurting anyone by having a little fun. Can't we find a middle ground here?" Mr. Dawson frowned, clearly unprepared for such unified resistance. He glanced at Karen, who looked equally flustered. For once, she didn't have a clipboard or a rehearsed speech to fall back on. All she could do was stand there, staring at the sea of defiant faces surrounding her. Finally, without another word, the pair turned and walked away. As they disappeared down the street, cheers erupted once more. The party resumed with renewed energy, fueled by a sense of victory and camaraderie. We hadn't just stood up to Karen. We'd reminded ourselves what it meant to be a real community. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cleanup began, I found myself reflecting on the day's events. Sure, we'd won this battle, but the war wasn't over. Karen wouldn't give up easily, and neither would the HOA. Still, as I watched my neighbors working together to pack up tables and sweep sidewalks, I felt hopeful. For the first time in a long time, Maplewood Drive felt like home, not because of perfect lawns or strict rules, but because of the people who lived here. Together, we were stronger than any regulation Karen could dream up. The barbecue may have ended, but the ripple effects of that day spread far beyond the smoky aroma of grilled meats and the laughter echoing through the cul-de-sac. By Monday morning, Karen's vegan-only rule, and our rebellion against it, had become the talk of Maplewood Drive. Conversations buzzed at bus stops, in driveways, and even in line at the local coffee shop. Everyone had an opinion. And for once, most of them leaned in our favor. Karen, however, wasn't about to let things slide. She launched a full-scale counterattack, flooding inboxes with emails titled Urgent HOA Meeting. Community standards under threat. Her tone was formal, almost robotic, as if she were trying to regain control by sounding professional. But her underlying message was clear. We'd crossed a line, and she intended to make us pay for it. The meeting was scheduled for Wednesday evening, and attendance was mandatory, or so she claimed. I half expected her to send someone door to door with a clipboard to mark who showed up. Greg groaned when I told him we had to go. "Do we really need to give her more attention?" he asked, rolling his eyes. But deep down, I knew avoiding the issue wouldn't solve anything. If we wanted this fight to end, we needed to face Karen head-on. When we arrived at the community center gymnasium that night, the room was packed. Every chair was taken, and latecomers stood along the walls, arms crossed and expressions wary. The air crackled with tension, a mix of anticipation and unease. At the front of the room stood Karen, flanked by Mr. Dawson, the HOA lawyer, and Linda Peterson, clutching her trusty copy of the association handbook like a lifeline. Karen began the meeting with a rehearsed speech about responsibility, sustainability, and the importance of following rules. "This isn't about personal preferences," she insisted, pacing back and forth like a politician delivering a campaign promise. "It's about protecting our environment and ensuring Maplewood Drive remains a model community." Her words might have sounded convincing if they weren't coming from someone who once fined a neighbor $50 for leaving their porch light on past midnight. As she spoke, murmurs of dissent rippled through the crowd. People shifted in their seats, exchanging skeptical glances. When she finally paused to take a breath, Evelyn raised her hand. "Yes, Miss Harper," Karen said, her voice dripping with forced politeness. Evelyn stood up, calm but confident. "You keep talking about sustainability," she said, addressing not just Karen but the entire room. "But is banning burgers really the best way to achieve that? Or is this just another excuse to micromanage everyone's lives?" Her question hit like a thunderclap. Heads nodded in agreement, and a few people muttered, "Exactly," under their breath. Encouraged by the response, others began chiming in. Mr. Thompson pointed out that his smoker used less energy than most kitchen appliances. Mrs. Patel argued that her homemade meals created less waste than prepackaged vegan alternatives. Even shy Timmy Jenkins piped up, saying he'd started composting after learning about food waste in school. Karen looked increasingly flustered as the tide turned against her. She glanced at Mr. Dawson for support, but even he seemed unsure of how to regain control. Finally, she snapped. "This isn't a debate," she shouted, slamming her clipboard onto the table. "The rules are the rules, and they're there for a reason." Her outburst backfired spectacularly. Instead of intimidating anyone, it only made her look desperate. Someone near the back called out, "Then why don't you follow your own rules, Karen? What's the last plant-based meal you cooked?" Laughter erupted, breaking the tension. For the first time, Karen didn't have a comeback. By the end of the meeting, the mood had shifted completely. Neighbors left in groups, chatting animatedly about compromise and finding solutions that worked for everyone. The rebellion hadn't just been about food. It had sparked a larger conversation about balance, freedom, and what it truly meant to live in a community. And while Karen still clung to her clipboard, it was clear her grip on Maplewood Drive was slipping. As Greg and I walked home that night, I felt a sense of pride, not just in standing up to Karen, but in realizing how much stronger we were together. Change was coming to Maplewood Drive, whether Karen liked it or not. Winter arrived, and with it came a quiet sense of peace that hadn't been felt in Maplewood Drive for years. The rebellion against Karen's vegan-only rule had sparked something bigger, a shift in how we thought about our neighborhood and each other. What started as a simple act of defiance over food turned into a movement toward unity, compromise, and mutual respect. It wasn't perfect. No community ever is, but it was progress. And sometimes, progress is all you can hope for. Karen became less visible after the policy changes. She still attended HOA meetings, but her once commanding presence had dulled to a whisper. Gone were the dramatic speeches and clipboard theatrics. Instead, she sat quietly in the corner, occasionally nodding along when someone else spoke. Some neighbors joked that she'd finally run out of rules to enforce, while others speculated she was plotting her next move. Personally, I think she was just tired of fighting, tired of pushing back against people who clearly didn't share her vision. Whatever the reason, her retreat marked the end of an era. Life went on. The grills that had fueled our rebellion were tucked away for the colder months, but the spirit of togetherness remained. Holiday lights twinkled in windows, wreaths hung on doors, and carolers made their rounds, filling the crisp air with music. For the first time, decorations weren't scrutinized for being too bright or up too early. Instead, they were celebrated as expressions of joy and creativity. Even Linda Peterson surprised everyone by stringing multicolored fairy lights across her porch, earning compliments from neighbors who never thought they'd see the day. Evelyn continued to be a force of inspiration in the community. Her neon green door stayed green, her cactus garden thrived despite the frost, and her wind chimes sang softly in the winter breeze. But what stood out most was her willingness to listen, to truly hear what others had to say. Whether it was helping Mrs. Potel organize a potluck or brainstorming ways to make the annual block party more inclusive, Evelyn reminded us all that standing up for yourself doesn't mean shutting others down. It means finding common ground, even when it feels impossible. As for me, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed, not just in the neighborhood, but within myself. Before the barbecue rebellion, I'd always played it safe, avoiding conflict at all costs. I let Greg convince me to attend meetings I didn't want to go to, sign petitions I didn't believe in, and kept my head down to avoid drawing attention. But standing up to Karen taught me something valuable. Silence isn't always golden. Sometimes speaking up, even when it's scary, is the only way to create real change. One snowy evening, Greg and I hosted a small gathering at our house. Neighbors brought dishes to share, and the dining table groaned under the weight of casseroles, pies, and platters of cookies. Evelyn arrived last, carrying a tray of her famous brownies. Vegan-friendly, she teased, winking as she set them down. Everyone laughed, including Linda, who reached for a second helping without hesitation. As we sat around the fire, swapping stories and sipping hot cocoa, I looked around the room and realized how far we'd come. These weren't just neighbors anymore. They were friends, people who supported each other, celebrated differences, and worked together to build something stronger than any rulebook could dictate. Later that night, as Greg and I cleaned up, he paused to glance out the window. Snow blanketed the cul-de-sac, softening the edges of the world outside. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "I think this might be the best year we've had here." I smiled, following his gaze. "Yeah," I agreed. "And it's because we stopped letting fear run the show." Maplewood Drive wasn't perfect. It probably never would be. But it was ours. Together, we'd proven that a neighborhood isn't defined by its rules or its houses. It's defined by the people who live there, their kindness, resilience, and determination to find joy in the little things, like burgers on a summer afternoon, laughter in the winter snow, and the courage to stand up for what really matters.